first, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to speak about the brain processes that governs alcohol addiction as a coping behavior. And just as a quick intro, I am Thang. I am a postdoc at Yale Psychiatry, and I completed my my doctoral training in neuroscience at Stony Brook University, and I came to Yale here in 2018. And since then, my research has been focusing on the brain mechanisms underlying alcohol addiction. And last year, I received funding from the NIH to investigate how pain promotes drinking and relapse. So I guess I can probably share my slides, and I'll go over the talk, and then we have some time at the end to to have a discussion. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. How that is that your typical format?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So let's do that. Okay. So can you see my slides now?
We can.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Okay, so yeah, so as the title tells you, this is the neuroprocesses underlying alcohol use as a coping behavior. And this is a topic that I care about, I care deeply about, and it is something that my work has been focusing on for the last 5 years or so. But you don't have to be interested in alcohol addiction to hopefully enjoy my talk. And that's because through our effort to understand the brain mechanisms involved in alcohol addiction, we learn a lot about the brain in other states of dependency as well. So for the talk, I'll go over the literature, the framework that we currently use to understand the relationship between drinking and avoidance coping. And at the end, I'll show you some exciting findings from our own lab. So before I get into the main topic, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I just wanted to offer a quick reminder that or some numbers that are associated with alcohol addiction. So we hear a lot about the opioid crisis, but more than half the cases treated for substance use actually involve alcohol. So today my talk will center around the broad framework of alcohol addiction that has three main components: reward dysregulation, heightened pain response, and loss of control. Now, you may be wondering why these components. That's because drinking can be a very rewarding activity, and that's why many people drink in the first place. But chronic drinking can change both the reward and pain circuits. And of course, when we talk about addiction, we often think about the impaired ability to regulate urges, craving, consumption. So that's the loss of control. So this framework covers these three critical components of alcohol addiction. So let's talk about the reward system and how it responds to drinking. Some of us may have had alcohol before, and you might recognize some words like buzz or euphoria. That's because alcohol can make you feel good. What exactly happens in the brain when we drink? From the work in rodents, we know that alcohol consumption stimulates the dopamine response or release in the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is typically implicated in the reward response. So by the way, we use mice and rats for this type of research, but they don't drink alcohol willingly. We have to use various tricks to induce alcohol drinking, including water deprivation or knocking out certain genes for these animals to start drinking alcohol. Another way for ethanol intake to affect the reward circuit is the activation of the mesolimbic dopamine system via the dopaminergic cell bodies in the ventral tegmental area, or the VTA. The VTA is also another critical component of the reward circuit. From the human side of things, we have found that alcohol intake can activate the nucleus accumbens and the medial orbital frontal cortex. Basically, these studies had human subjects consume alcohol during the scan, whether it's an fMRI or PET, and they found activation or increase in mu opioid receptors binding in these regions. Interestingly enough, even pictures of alcohol sufficiently in getting responses in the regions as shown here on the right. So I briefly mentioned earlier that a couple of neurotransmitters like dopamine, opioids. So dopamine, as you know, is implicated in reward processing, including reward learning. And this is why individuals with alcohol use disorder or AUD show impaired learning that involves the association between actions and outcomes. Dopamine shows increases with alcohol administration. And this is partly the reason why dopamine receptors antagonists can reduce the reinstatement of alcohol use in patients receiving treatment for AUD when they were exposed to alcohol use. Opioid receptor is another important neurotransmitter. This receptor can bind with opioids to produce pain relief. And there has been a lot of work showing that pain relief is inherently rewarding. With drinking, we think that it can mediate the rewarding effects of alcohol. And as you know, that a medication designed to target these mechanisms like naltrexone. Another component is the endocannabinoid, which are substances produced from within the body that can activate the cannabinoid receptors. The endocannabinoid system plays a role in control of movement, in motor processing, in learning, memory, emotion, and motivation. And so naturally, this system is involved in alcohol addiction. We have evidence showing that decrease in endocannabinoid levels in the endocannabinoid system may deter relapse behavior. So far, I've showed you what happens in the brain. Behaviorally, we also see reward dysregulation. So for those with problem drinking, we typically see that they have increased reward sensitivity, sensation seeking, and delayed discounting. So what that means is that these individuals are greatly motivated by reward, and they tend to pursue short-term rewards, even if that means that we incur negative long-term consequences. So drinkers also have high expectancy of alcohol-derived pleasure. So all this together can translate into impulsive drinking, binge drinking, and disregard for long-term outcome. Now back to the brain. Earlier I showed that I showed the effects of alcohol acute alcohol administration. So chronic drinking produce very different effects. Here is a classic PET study which measure how the brain responded to methylphenidate, which is a stimulant. So on the top images, you see a strong response to methylphenidate in the striatal area in healthy controls. For the subjects with AUD, the response was a lot weaker, as you can see by the cooler color in the striatum. So this is evidence for what we call blunting of the reward system, which means that the reward system responds weakly to reward stimuli. And those with addiction typically require larger rewards to achieve the same effects as compared to healthy controls. In other words, they have a reduction in reward sensitivity. Now, this reward blunting also applies to rewards that are commonly found in our daily life, like food, money, or sex. Here are some of the studies that found that the ventral striatal activation to monetary gains negatively correlated with alcohol craving in chronic drinkers. So there are potentially two ways of reading this sort of phenomenon. One, chronic alcohol use reduces reward sensitivity, and two, those with alcohol addiction may place more value on alcohol as a reward at the expense of other rewards like food, for instance. What happens at the neuronal level? We have observed molecular and cellular changes within the reward circuit in response to excessive alcohol use. One example is the decrease in dopaminergic and glutaminergic neurotransmission in the nucleus accumbens during acute withdrawal. And I think this explains the aversive effects of alcohol withdrawal that you guys have frequently observed in your patients. Excessive engagement of the reward circuit due to chronic drinking can also lead to changes in the reward circuit interaction with other systems at the brain system, like stress, for example. We see hyperactivity in the brain system, in the brain stress systems, as reflected by elevated adrenocorticotropic hormone or the extended amygdala system during acute withdrawal. So we have focused on the reward system so far, and we touch on the stress network a little bit. But other networks also undergo changes, including the executive control, saliency, memory, and sensory. This is why it's so difficult to understand and tease out the various impacts of alcohol or other substance of abuse, for that matter, in the brain. So just to summarize everything that I've shown so far about the reward response in alcohol addiction. First, we have consumption of alcohol that may be induced by the rewarding effects of alcohol. With chronic drinking, we have dysregulation of the reward system and other brain circuit that interact with the brain with the reward circuits, including the stress, the saliency, executive control, and sensory. And these changes may induce further drinking due to lack of control, or increased sensitivity to alcohol, or increased sensitivity to the pain withdrawal effects. So this creates a spiraling cycle of drinking and dysregulation. So out of the many brain circuits, one that has received a lot of attention in recent years is the pain circuit, actually. And this may seem out of left field because most people start drinking or using drugs to feel good. So naturally, we focus on the reward system. This focus gives a lot of information about the early stages of alcohol addiction. But as I'll show you, the brain circuit can reveal a lot about the pain circuit can reveal a lot about the escalation and the maintenance of chronic drinking. And that's because individuals with addiction derive much less pleasure from drinking. Instead, they drink to manage emotional and physical pain. And this is how drinking becomes a maladaptive coping behavior. So we can first look at what happens to chronic drinkers. For them, the acute consumption of alcohol produces pain relief. So many people drink to alleviate pain symptoms, and they drink as a way to self-medicate. But over time, interestingly, drinking heightens pain sensitivity, and this has been shown in both humans and animals. So ironically, chronic drinking results in hyperalgesia. And of course, hyperalgesia promotes even more drinking. So you end up with a spiraling cycle, as I mentioned earlier. So in a way, alcohol addiction is a chronic pain disorder. So going from drinking for pleasure to drinking to avoid pain, we have this fundamental shift of motivation from positive to negative reinforcement. To summarize, we have drinking as a pain relieving behavior, which temporarily leads to analgesia, but alcohol dependence and withdrawal increase pain sensitivity, resulting in hyperalgesia. And hyperalgesia can in turn promote can promote pain sensitivity, and chronic pain reinforces drinking as a maladaptive coping behavior. Now we know pain plays a critical role in the escalation and maintenance of chronic alcohol use. What are some of the brain structures that support our brain response? So this is what I'm showing here is a recent meta-analysis of brain imaging studies that examine neuroactivation to physical pain, and they found significant responses in the insula, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the amygdala, the periaqueductal gray, and the middle frontal gyrus. And if you simply look up the brain regions implicated in pain, you will immediately see that these are the same regions found in addiction or implicated in addiction. Coincidence? I think not. So there is a potential overlap or substantial overlap in neurobiology between pain and addiction. Do we have evidence for it? The answer is that we do. The brain regions involved in pain processing have also been found to participate in cognitive control, saliency processing, stress response, and motor processing. So when chronic drinking produces enhanced pain response, these functions are also affected. And because these functions can impact how individuals respond to alcohol use or alcohol cues, control their drinking, how they control their drinking urges, their drinking behavior is naturally affected. Next, I'm going to talk briefly about some of the brain regions and how they may be involved in alcohol addiction. First, the insula. The insula responds very strongly to pain, and we see this in literature, and we see this in our own lab. And we think that its primary function is to integrate information about the saliency of impending pain stimuli. And we found that, interestingly, we found that the insula increases activation during alcohol craving, and damage to insula independent smokers was associated with increased success in smoking sensation. So clearly it has a role to play in addiction behavior, in addictive behavior. Another region is amygdala. The amygdala has abundant pain responsive neurons. The amygdala tends to respond to negative emotion or aversive stimuli. And administration of opioid receptor antagonists in the amygdala reduces oral alcohol self-administration in rats, likely because this dampens the pain response. Another region is the periaqueductal gray, which is, or the PAG, is a very small region implicated in negative emotion, pain response, threat, escape, and especially avoidance behavior. So earlier I talked about alcohol use as a pain avoidance behavior. So this is where sort of the region fits in. Several studies have found that alcohol withdrawal induced hyperalgesia is mediated in part by this region, or its projection with the amygdala, and disruption of the medial prefrontal modulation on the PAG results in compulsive drinking despite negative consequences, and that's been found recently in rodent. Reduce cognitive control. This is a component of the framework that is probably most familiar to people, the lack of control in addiction. In fact, it is a hallmark feature of substance abuse. There are two main characteristics of lack of control. One, weakened control in response to reward, and this manifests in heightened craving and urges, which drive seeking behavior. And two, weakened control in response to pain, and this manifests in avoidance behavior. So when cognitive control is reduced, we see this shift to automatic and habitual processing. And with that, we get impulsive and compulsive drinking. And with that, we get disregard for harmful consequences from alcohol misuse. The primary region associated with cognitive control is the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. We have a lot of studies that show functional and structural changes in the PFC following chronic drinking. There may be also a predisposition to addictive behavior, like certain genes that can influence the PFC function as well. But obviously, there's hope. Genes do not solely determine behaviors. Also, in terms of toxicity, we did a meta-analysis on the prefrontal cortex, which show hypoactivity in individuals with addiction. And this hypoactivity was associated with impaired response inhibition or reduced cognitive control. But for individuals who became abstinent, the hypoactivity gradually became normalized. So perhaps changes induced by drugs, by drug use or drinking are not permanent, and we can at least partially rescue certain brain function and cognitive control by maintaining sobriety. So I think it is a very important point from a clinical perspective. Another region is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, or the VMPFC. And this is a region that plays a critical role in cognitive control. Individuals with AUD show disengagement of the VMPFC during decision making. And they show a switch from deliberate goal-directed decision making to habitual processing. And we see the switch in the deactivation of the region. In a really cool science paper several years ago, this group found that when a person faces distal threat, and this is when they have time to prepare and plan escape, and having a good degree of control, the VMPFC is highly activated. When the threat is close, when escape is imminent and you have to make immediate action to avoid the threat, then the PAG is activated. So with a bit of inverse inference, we can perhaps view this as evidence showing that for drinkers with addiction, the pain is likely seen as an immediate threat, and that has to be dealt with urgently, and this prompt habitual processing and impulsive drinking. So how does all this fit together? Here we have a very simplified sort of model of pain and alcohol addiction. So we have several pain circuits that support pain and cognitive control. So we have the blue, or the fast processing pain via the spinal thalamic tract, and the pink is also fast processing pain via the amygdala pathway. The blue and the pink are likely upregulated in those with addiction. So basically you have this increased activity or upregulation of the fast processing system, where you have to immediately deal with the pain, or immediately deal with the threat, and drinking is a good sort of solution for that. And on the other side of things, you have this downregulation of the prefrontal system, where you have decision-making process, where you have cognitive control, and these are reduced in addiction. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this slide. And so this is a summary of what we discussed so far with regard to pain and alcohol addiction. So alcohol acutely relieves pain, but chronic drinking induces hyperalgesia, which motivate further drinking, and therefore drinking becomes a maladaptive coping strategy. So as I mentioned earlier, we have this fundamental shift of motivation from positive to negative reinforcement. In terms of the brain, we have this very interesting and substantial overlap between the pain and in terms of neurobiology of pain and alcohol addiction. We'll talk about some of the brain regions like insula, the amygdala, or the periaqueductal gray. We have the hyperactivity of the pain system, and we have the opposite effect with the cognitive control system, including the prefrontal cortex. And here again, the three main components of the addiction framework: the reward dysregulation, the heightened pain response, and the loss of control. Just to sort of bring everything together, this is sort of a flow chart showing that sort of the path from pain reactivity to addiction. So basically, when you have increase in pain reactivity and you have decrease in cognitive control, then you sort of see this manifesting in the brain. You have increased response in the pain circuit, and you have decreased response in the prefrontal cortex, and these changes are associated with increased avoidance coping behavior, and you see sort of the direct impact of that on drinking behavior. So you have a lot of you have craving, you have urges, and you have compulsive drinking. So for the next part, I'm going to talk about our work here in the lab. So I mentioned earlier that we receive funding from the NIH, and our goal is to look at how the pain response motivate or how that has an impact on the escalation to drinking and how that might impact recovery or relapse in individuals who are receiving treatment for AUD. So basically, we bring in social drinkers, we bring in problem drinkers, and we bring in patients who are receiving treatment for AUD. And we, so when they come in, we conduct a bunch of clinical and cognitive assessments. We train them on a learning task, and then we put them in the scanner where they perform the same task, learning task, so we can measure their responses to reward and pain, and how they use this information to learn to learn avoidance behavior. So this is the avoidance learning task that we have them use. So just very quickly, basically they see a bunch of pictures, and they have an option of either respond, either press a button to respond, or not press a button. So basically, by using that, we look at their the brain processes underlying the initiation of an action or the inhibition of an action. And after they respond or not respond, they get either money or they get shot. And through the association between the cue and the outcomes, they learn how to either respond or not respond to these cues. Okay, so this is because they have to either respond or not respond, and they have and for the outcome they have either money or pain. So this is a 2x2 design. So you have basically go to get money, or go to avoid shop, or no go to avoid money, or no go to avoid. So this is their behavioral findings in social drinkers and problem drinkers. So the problem drinkers are in purple, and the social drinkers are in blue. So on the left-hand side here, it's just a very quick analysis of their performance accuracy. And we see that across the 4 conditions, and as I said earlier, it's a 2x2 condition, 2x2 design. So there's 4 different conditions. And you can see that the social drinkers perform significantly better across the board compared to the problem drinkers. And if you look to the right here, this is the map showing the correct response probability over time. So basically, when they first perform the task, they don't know the meanings of the images. They don't know whether if they press a button or they not press a button. They don't know what kind of feedback they're going to get, either money or shop. So they respond at random at the beginning, but over time, as they learn the association between the action and outcomes, they figured out whether how to respond to the stimuli. So as you can see that going from left to right, you see this gradual increase in the correct response probability, which indicated that they learn over time. But again, if you look at the 2 different colors, the purple and the blue, you see that the problem drinkers learn slowly, and they never quite reach the same level as the social drinkers. So this is an indication that they learn more slowly. And if you look at the differences between the 2 groups, these differences are more pronounced in the avoidance condition, which means that when it comes to avoiding pain, social drinkers are much better, and the problem drinkers are much more impaired when it comes to that particular condition. So what happens in the brain then? So because we scanned people, and the data collection is still ongoing. So this is just a snapshot of our data at the early stages. So if we look at their avoidance learning, and we look at their drinking severity, then we see this very interesting correlation or relationship. The more severe they're drinking, and the more impaired in terms of avoidance learning. And when we ask them what it is, the main thing that drives their drinking behavior, one of the metrics that we use is drinking to avoid pain, physical discomfort. And we found that the more they drink to avoid physical discomfort, the more they drink to avoid pain, the more impaired they are in avoidance learning. And when we look at the how this translates into brain activity, and we found that the more they drink to avoid pain, the more they are impaired in the avoidance learning, the lower the activation in the prefrontal cortex. And as I mentioned earlier, the prefrontal cortex is the main structure associated with cognitive control. So basically, what we found here is very consistent with the framework that has been adopted in animal literature, and now we're seeing that in human work as well. So basically, for heavy drinkers, for chronic drinkers, problem drinkers, you see this hyper reactivity to pain, impaired avoidance learning, and deactivation of the prefrontal cortex. So that's the end of my talk, and here's just a quick slide showing my acknowledgement, my funding sources, the people involved in the work here that you briefly saw at the end, and of course, thank you for listening to my talk.